Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam from Historic Travels and welcome to another video. Alright guys, well hey, the time you all have been waiting on for quite a while has finally come. It is now time to continue the story of the RMS Titanic's first officer, William Murdoch, the man who was directly responsible for getting the most people off of the Titanic before the ship went down. Now in episode 1, because this is a multi-part series, we covered Murdoch's story leading up to the point that he got on board the Titanic. This episode will tell Murdoch's story up to the point that the full-scale evacuation of the Titanic officially began. And while I did try to make this just a 2-episode series, there is so much information out there about Murdoch, it's actually going to end up being a 3-episode series. So guys, if you enjoyed part 1 and part 2, and if you missed part 1, I will include a link to that video in the description below. Make sure you guys tune in for episode 3 because Murdoch's story is absolutely incredible. Alright everybody, well hey, with the intro out of the way, let's now continue the story of First Officer William Murdoch. We are resuming Murdoch's story during the maiden voyage of Titanic. Up to this point, things have performed mostly okay with the Titanic. There were a couple of incidents that had to be addressed, like the Titanic's near collision with a ship called the New York while it was leaving Southampton, and there was a small coal fire burning in boiler room number 6 that also had to be dealt with. But still, all things considered, the maiden voyage of Titanic was going very well. The ship was making very good time, her engines were being broken in, and everything was going great with the Titanic. As far as how Murdoch was doing, well, he had a pretty good crossing on board the Titanic up to this point. He did his shifts on the Titanic's bridge, performed whatever other tasks were needed of him, and then, besides that, he was simply enjoying his time on board the White Star's brand new ocean liner. However, all that would change on the night of April the 14th, 1912, when the fate of William Murdoch would be changed forever. Now, on the night of April the 14th, 1912, First Officer William Murdoch was due to start his shift on the Titanic's bridge at 10 p.m. ship's time, and the officer in charge of the Titanic's bridge before Murdoch was Second Officer Charles Lightoller. Now, there's one important thing you all need to understand about how the bridge shifts worked on board the Titanic. You see, the senior officers basically rotated on and off the Titanic's bridge in 4-hour shifts. Now, because Lightoller was in charge of the Titanic's bridge before Murdoch, his shift on the bridge went from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. And then logically, Murdoch's shift on the Titanic's bridge was going to be from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. Now, at roughly 9:45 p.m., Captain Smith arrived on the Titanic's bridge, and he had a brief conversation with Lightoller where they discussed everything from the Titanic's speed as it was traveling across the Atlantic, they discussed the ice warnings, they discussed the weather conditions around the ship, and so on and so forth. What the men decided was, even though there was a risk of icebergs in the area that the Titanic was currently sailing through, the weather conditions from these two men's perspective on the Titanic's bridge looked absolutely perfect. It looked like that these men could see for miles around in all directions from the Titanic's bridge. So what Captain Smith decided was, he decided to have the Titanic keep steaming across the Atlantic at its current speed of somewhere between 21 to 22 knots. And he told Lightoller before he left the bridge that if anything was to change that may threaten the Titanic, put any risk to the ship or whatever, they were to let him know and take appropriate actions. So despite what some people would have you believe, that Captain Smith was being careless or whatever, that wasn't the case at all. He was taking every precaution, but from the men's perspective, it looked like it was perfectly safe to keep going at 21 to 22 knots. After this conversation was complete, Captain Smith retired to his cabin for the evening. However, his cabin was directly behind the bridge, so the senior officer in charge of the bridge would have no trouble getting to him in an emergency. A few minutes after this conversation was done, Murdoch arrived on the Titanic's bridge to take command of it. Lightoller passed Captain Smith's instructions on to Murdoch. Murdoch said he understood, and then he began his shift on the Titanic's bridge, keeping a sharp eye out on the horizon for anything that may pose a risk to the Titanic. Now, after Murdoch started his shift, his initial thoughts about the weather conditions that the Titanic was sailing through were basically the same as Lightoller and Smith. He thought it was perfectly safe and reasonable for the Titanic to keep operating at its current speed. However, what Murdoch didn't realize was that at this current time, the Titanic was steaming through a very strange weather phenomenon known as a cold water mirage. Now in this video, I'm not going to be going into too much detail about what exactly cold water mirages are and how do they work. I already covered that topic in detail in another video, so if you would like to check that out, I will include a link to that video in the description below, so feel free to go and watch that. However, for this video, the only thing you need to understand about cold water mirages is this. Basically, what happens is, under the right weather conditions, while a ship like the Titanic is sailing across the Atlantic, it can encounter these cold water mirages. And in a nutshell, what happens is it creates an optical illusion where when you're standing on the deck of a ship, you think you can see for miles around in all directions. However, it creates this thing that's called a false horizon, which obscures the real horizon. So while you think you can see for miles around in all directions, there's actually a huge chunk of space directly in your field of view that you can't see. It's hidden by this optical illusion. So while from Murdoch's perspective on the Titanic, he thought he could see for miles around in all directions, he was actually sailing with a very big blind spot directly in front of the Titanic. And it was inside of this blind spot that Titanic's iceberg was laying in wait. Then, at 11:39 p.m. Titanic time, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, who at this point in time were in the Titanic's crow's nest, suddenly saw a weird shape appear on the horizon. It was an iceberg directly ahead of the Titanic. Right after Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee spotted the iceberg directly ahead of the Titanic, the first thing they did was they rang the warning bell located within the Titanic's crow's nest 3 times to let the Titanic's bridge crew know, hey, there's something going on, we see something, there's something up ahead of the Titanic that's a risk to the ship. Once they rang the warning bell, Frederick Fleet then used a telephone system that connected the Titanic's crow's nest to the Titanic's bridge. He called the bridge using this telephone to let them know there's an iceberg right ahead. The telephone on the bridge was picked up by 6th Officer Moody, who asked Frederick Fleet, "What do you see?" Frederick Fleet replied, "Iceberg right ahead." Moody simply responded, "Thank you," and hung up the phone. Now, there is some debate among historians about what exactly happened next. Some historians believe that it was this telephone call between Frederick Fleet and Moody that let Murdoch know that there was an iceberg directly ahead of the Titanic. However, if you go back and look at the testimony, Frederick Fleet said that by the time he had called the Titanic's bridge, he had noticed that the Titanic was already starting to turn. So what I think happened was, I think that as soon as Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee rang the warning bell from the Titanic's crow's nest, I think First Officer William Murdoch could already see the iceberg from where he was standing at the time on the Titanic's starboard side bridge wing. That's where he was when the iceberg was spotted. I think he simply looked off from the bridge wing, looked up ahead of the Titanic, and saw the iceberg right at the time or maybe right after the warning bell rang. This would explain to me why the Titanic was already starting to turn by the time Frederick Fleet had called the Titanic's bridge and spoke to Moody. Now, as soon as William Murdoch became aware of the iceberg directly ahead of the Titanic, he gave 2 orders to all the Titanic's crew currently on the ship's bridge. The first thing he did was he ordered the Titanic's helmsman, Quartermaster Hitchens, to turn the Titanic hard to starboard, which, due to tiller commands, means to turn the Titanic to port. The next thing he did was he ordered the Titanic's engines to be stopped. Once this was done, there was nothing else Murdoch could do but simply stand on the Titanic's starboard side bridge wing and watch the approaching iceberg to see if the Titanic could turn quick enough to dodge the iceberg in time. However, despite the quick actions of William Murdoch, there simply wasn't enough time to turn the Titanic enough to where the vessel would miss the iceberg. At 11:40 p.m. on April the 14th, 1912, RMS Titanic struck the iceberg along the starboard side below the waterline. The resulting impact opened up 6 of the Titanic's 16 watertight compartments to the sea. And from this point on, the fate of Titanic has already been sealed. No matter what anybody does on board the ship, the Titanic will sink. Now, immediately following the collision between the Titanic and the iceberg, Murdoch gave another quick command to the Titanic's helmsman, Quartermaster Hitchens. He ordered Hitchens to turn the Titanic hard to port, which, due to tiller commands, means to turn the ship to starboard. Why would he do this? Because, don't forget, the iceberg is located on the Titanic's starboard side, and with the iceberg right there beside the ship, wouldn't it be dangerous to turn the Titanic towards the iceberg you were just trying to turn the other way to avoid? Well, here's the thing. You see, even though the Titanic was turning to port to dodge the iceberg, After the initial collision between the Titanic and the berg, the Titanic's bow was now pulling away clear of the berg. Just pretend my fist is the iceberg. However, the Titanic was so large that even though the Titanic's bow was pulling away from the berg, the Titanic's stern was still heading towards a direct impact. So this could open up even more watertight compartments to the sea along the Titanic's stern. It could damage the Titanic's propellers, and there's just 1,000 things that could happen if the Titanic's stern hit the iceberg. So, by Murdoch ordering Quartermaster Hitchens to turn the Titanic hard to port, aka starboard, this would, as a result, move the Titanic's stern away from the iceberg, so the Titanic could successfully dodge the berg and sail around the iceberg without any risk of further damage to the Titanic. Due to Murdoch's quick thinking, the Titanic's stern did successfully avoid colliding with the iceberg. However, it was a very, very near miss, as you can see in this animation. Immediately following the initial collision between the Titanic and the iceberg, Murdoch then went and threw a bunch of electrical switches located on the Titanic's bridge that automatically shut the Titanic's watertight doors. These massive steel doors then began to slowly slide into place, thus sealing off all of the Titanic's watertight compartments from each other. So, by doing this, Murdoch hoped that this would be enough to successfully contain the water now entering the Titanic, and thus prevent the Titanic from sinking. However, even with the Titanic's watertight doors now shut, the thing about the Titanic's watertight compartments is, you see, the watertight bulkheads on the Titanic didn't go all the way up to the boat deck. They only stretched up to around E deck, which was somewhere around 10 to 11 feet above the waterline. Now, under normal circumstances, this is okay. You know, like, water inside of a ship will not go higher than what the waterline is on the outside. So that means that if the Titanic had only breached a couple of watertight compartments at the front of the ship, the bow would sink down so low, the ship would stabilize, and the water couldn't proceed up any higher than that. However, with 6 watertight compartments in the Titanic's bow opened up to the sea, the Titanic's bow would sink down so low that it would allow the water to reach the top of the watertight compartments and spill over them and travel back and back and back and back, further and further into the ship. So it was a mathematical certainty that with this kind of damage, even with the watertight doors shut, nothing could be done to save the Titanic. The best case scenario that everybody on board the ship could hope for is that the watertight doors would simply slow down the water a bit. But as I said, no matter what they did at this point, the Titanic was going to sink. Now, around 1 minute after the Titanic collided with the iceberg, Titanic's captain, Captain Smith, arrived on the Titanic's bridge. He asked William Murdoch what had just happened because he easily felt the collision from his cabin. William Murdoch told the captain that the Titanic had collided with an iceberg. He also told Captain Smith that he tried to get around the berg, however was too close. Upon hearing this, Captain Smith ordered William Murdoch to close the watertight doors. William Murdoch then replied, "The doors are closed, sir." Now, over the course of the next 20 to 30 minutes, Captain Smith would perform several inspections of the RMS Titanic. Now, it isn't exactly clear on where Murdoch was during these initial inspections of the ship. However, I believe Murdoch was on or within close proximity to the Titanic's bridge. This would make sense since he knew he would be needed on the Titanic's boat deck with the lifeboats if they deemed to be necessary. Anyway, Captain Smith returned from one of his inspections at 12 a.m., at which point in time Captain Smith ordered his crew up on the boat deck to begin prepping the lifeboats. However, at this point in time, he did not order the passengers up on deck. He didn't order the boats swung out over the ship's side. He just told his crew to begin the initial stages of prepping the boats. Now, after this was done, Captain Smith left the bridge and did another inspection of the Titanic. He returned to the bridge around 12:10, 12:12 a.m., somewhere around there, at which point in time he ordered to have the passengers all brought up to the boat deck, and he ordered to have the lifeboats swung out and prepared for launch. Now, even at this point in time, Captain Smith did not yet know for certain that the Titanic was sinking. However, he had seen enough to know that the situation was serious enough that a full-scale evacuation of the Titanic may be necessary. Now, it's also important to note that, unlike what you see in the James Cameron feature film, evidence suggests that there was no large-scale meeting between Captain Smith and all of the Titanic's officers about the true seriousness of the situation with the Titanic. It seems that the dire situation that the ship was in, well, news of this was spread around the Titanic by word of mouth. Now, I'm not going to go as far and say that there was no small-scale meeting between some of the Titanic's officers and Captain Smith. Evidence suggests that something like this did happen. However, it just wasn't a massive, large-scale gathering between all of the ship's personnel, like what you see in the James Cameron film. Now, when Captain Smith officially gave the order to have the Titanic's lifeboat swung over the ship's side and to have all of the Titanic's passengers brought up to the boat deck, he also decided to make First Officer William Murdoch in charge of launching and lowering all of the Titanic's lifeboats along the ship's starboard side. He then ordered Chief Officer Henry Wilde to be put in charge of lowering all of the Titanic's lifeboats on the port side. Now, if you're curious about that, because most of you Titanic historians out there would know it was Lightoller in charge of lowering all the lifeboats on the port side, well, it seems that, based on the research I did, Captain Smith originally did put Henry Wilde in charge of the boats on the port side. However, it looks like Lightoller just kind of got fed up with Henry Wilde and went off and did his own thing. I did talk about that in my Henry Wilde video. If you would like to watch that video, I will include a link to that video in the description below. Then, at some point between 12:23 and 12:25 a.m., Captain Smith had a short meeting with the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, who gave Captain Smith the terrible news. The Titanic was going to sink. At this time, Captain Smith gave the order to begin loading all of the Titanic's lifeboats with passengers and lower them away. At this point in time, First Officer William Murdoch knew that it was his responsibility to get as many people off of the Titanic as possible before the Titanic sank out from underneath them. Alright everybody, well hey, I think this is the appropriate place to pause Murdoch's story for now. If you enjoyed this video, be sure you leave it a like. If you're new here, please subscribe to the channel and make sure you tune in to episode 3 when we talk about how Murdoch got all of the lifeboats he could off of the Titanic before the ship went down. Alright everybody, well hey, thank you all so much for watching and I will see you all in the next one. Have a great day everybody.